welcome back to the Popular Show with me, James A. Smith. It's the 1st of June. It's the start of Feral Girl Summer, and there's no girl more feral than David Slavic.
Yes.
Hello, David. How are you doing?
I'm here, and I just want to tell the audience, we always like to give a little bit of a Newfoundland update. I was at the park today, and I went to check out the sort of edge of the woods, and there was a lynx watching my kids in the woods, and I realized that you're never safe, no matter how far away you think you are.
The lynx was watching the kids. Was this?
It might have been watching me. I'm more meat than the kids.
How big is a lynx? How big is a lynx? Can it carry away a child?
I don't think he can carry a child, but they can be up to about 2.5 feet long, about 18 to 24 inches tall. They have paws that are about, I want to say about half of a man's hand, and they can be quite aggressive. But the interesting thing about that is that there's a 12-year hair cycle, which that's the rabbits, and we are in the peak year of the hare, so the lynx tend to stay away from public, which is good. But apparently they were hanging out.
This is the Popular Show, the show that, like a fine episode of Seinfeld, takes all those strands of topics that you've been worried about and brings them together in not always comedic conclusion. We want to say hello to the Sublation Media audience on YouTube, as well as our regular podcast audience on the podcast stream, and we especially want to thank our Patreon supporters and other big money donors. We've got to say hello to Joe, Dara, Roberto, and everyone else who signed up to Patreon over the last few days. We really appreciate all of you. David, we've got an amazing guest and a really great show lined up today. Maybe you want to introduce Natalie for us.
So Natalie Shure is one of my favorite sort of writers on the left. She's a bit heterodox in her approach in that she often makes people on the left angry, but also people on the right angry. She's just a brilliant wordsmith. She has a great piece in the New Republic where she's a columnist called "It's Stop Trying to Extract Larger Lessons from the Amber Heard Johnny Depp Trial." And what she does in this article, and we'll discuss further, is something that I think she does in a lot of her articles, where she really zeroes in on sort of like an understanding that people have about sort of a topic and sort of pulls out the important parts and points out where people are misunderstanding it. And I think that's one of the like key public services of a journalist. And I think you're doing it great, Natalie.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And thank you for having me.
Yeah.
How are you, Natalie?
I'm doing pretty good. I was excited to hear about the links.
Yeah, it's quite fun. We frequently have them in the yard. One day I was hanging up an old quilt, and I was getting the sea breeze from the ocean, and the quilt blew up, and there was a lynx right in front of me.
Wow.
And yeah,
Newfoundland just seems like one of these like fascinating storybook places that is unlike anywhere else. I've seen it in, photos and video, but haven't been there in real life. But it seems really interesting.
Well, it was funny when I married my wife. I had to go up and see her father. And her father is a very nice but quite scary man, and he didn't approve because he didn't know. And he said, my daughter, she went to Harvard, she should get married or whatever. I don't know what he was thinking, but she's better than this to marry an American and
a mere podcaster. A humble podcaster. And when I started to look at it, I said, this is the most beautiful place I've ever seen. And I didn't really realize she was from here. And now we live here. And for those people interested in staying here, we will have an Airbnb available in the fall.
Ooh, very exciting.
So this is going out on Sunday, but we're recording on Wednesday. It's one of those nights on the Popular Show where we're recording in the white heat of the moment, because it's only been a couple of hours since the jury arrived at its deliberation on the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case. People are melting down on Twitter, as they are wont to do. Natalie, you've been paying a lot of attention to this case. I wondered if you could sort of introduce it to the audience and why it matters, why people should care.
Sure. Well, I think the reason that people should care is perhaps this is probably the biggest news story in the United States, or has been one of the biggest news stories for the past 6 weeks or so. The facts of the case are basically that Johnny Depp, movie star, and Amber Heard, slightly lower tier movie star, were married for about 15 months from the beginning of 2015 till mid 2016, and had, by all accounts, an incredibly tumultuous relationship. At the end of the relationship, she filed for divorce and a temporary restraining order. They end up settling and releasing a statement, and then a couple things happen. A few years later, the Sun tabloid in the UK runs a story saying that Johnny Depp's a wife beater. Why does J.K. Rowling still want to cast him in her latest, I don't know, it's some Harry Potter prequel. And so he sued that tabloid in the UK for defamation. And then I believe concurrently, Amber Heard wrote an op-ed toward the end of 2018 for the Washington Post, basically not explicitly, but implicitly identifying herself as a victim of domestic violence, or a public figure associated with domestic abuse, who essentially, experience the full force of society's wrath toward women who come forward. The online headline included a sexual violence complaint that she had never made publicly before. There's a big picture of her on it, and everyone understood it to be about Johnny Depp. It specifically marked 2 years before, and 2 years before she had been on the cover of People magazine and was all over TMZ for filing this restraining order temporarily. People largely know her for having been married to Johnny Depp, who is, of course, a way bigger star. And so he sued her for defamation in Virginia, which is where the servers of the Washington Post are. So that's how they were able to get jurisdiction in Fairfax County, Virginia, which I think also there was some legal strategy underlying it in terms of, it being a solicitous jurisdiction for defamation suits. So the case in the UK was decided against Depp. That was ruled in about, I think, March of 2020 or so. It was during COVID early on. And this case just went to trial a few months ago. They brought cameras in the courtroom because the judge was concerned that, it would be a feeding frenzy otherwise, with too many media folks trying to get in and that kind of thing. So decided to take the pressure off by having cameras. And I think about 1 million people have been streaming it a day. Basically the facts of the case, the legal questions have been whether she made defamatory statements about Johnny Depp in, implying that he was a domestic abuser, et cetera. The case ended up being largely about whether or not her allegations were true, whether or not abuse actually happened. Both of them testified. Both of them had witnesses who testified, et cetera. It lasted about 6 weeks. Today, the jury delivers a verdict, found all 3 of his claims to have been defamatory, and surprisingly found 1 of her 3 claims to have been defamatory for much lower damages. That was sort of a long spiel, but just wanted to get everyone caught up just in case they weren't aware. As for what this means and why it's important, as I said, it's incredibly popular. Viewers have been pretty overwhelmingly on Johnny Depp's side. There's been a lot of weird social media algorithms really pushing this at people on a constant basis at a level that I think is not something that I'm used to, just finding this in my feed all the time. I think there can be a misogynist tinge to plenty of these, Depp stans, these diehard Depp fans who are tweeting about it all the time. And, there's a lot of concern that on the part of the broader left, I would say that this represents the, downfall of MeToo, that people's, eagerness to side with Depp means that we have stopped believing women, etc. So, whether or not this is a referendum on misogyny, what it means in terms of, how we treat women in the public sphere, people have been grappling with these questions pretty constantly over the course of 6 weeks.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, like from a number of strands. In the first place, it takes us back to 2018 when that op-ed was written, right in the heart of Me Too, and offers a kind of relitigation in some ways of events that went on there. Although you, in your article, plead a certain amount of caution over that. It's interesting from the point of view of the way that big court cases are a very particular kind of interactive media event now. Of course, that's been true of a lot of big cases in the past. But I haven't been trying to pay attention to this, but it's really been pushed on me. Twitter has been full of it. I'm sure that other social media that people use have been trying to sort of make similar gains out of it. And there's also a kind of cultural interest, especially with the kind of the stuff going on TikTok that you alluded to, this sort of fandom culture that has erupted around this. So it's kind of culturally interesting, and not least from a generational perspective. For people who haven't seen this sort of thing, just drop a few kind of clips now of the kinds of reaction that people have been having over on TikTok to this case.
You still haven't donated the $7 million divorce settlement to charity. Isn't that right?
Incorrect. I pledged the entirety of the settlement, $7 million to charity, and I intend to fulfill those obligations.
Ms. Heard, that's not my question. Please,
what was
try
your
to
question?
Answer my question. Sitting here today, you have not donated the $7 million, donated, not pledged, donated the $7 million divorce settlement to charity.
I use pledge and donation synonymous with one another.
But I don't. Ms. Heard, I don't use it synonymously.
That's how donations are paid.
Ms. Heard, respectfully, that's not my question. So as of today, you have not donated, paid $7 million of your divorce settlement to charity, right?
I have not been able to fulfill those obligations yet.
And that's because you did want something, didn't you?
I didn't want anything.
Heartbroken. And I sat there for a long time, and I eventually turned the key and drove home. And what did you do after that?
So it's just been an extraordinary and bizarre culture of reenactments, of lip syncing, of reperforming kind of elements from the case, of zeroing in on mannerisms and kind of facial expressions and figures of speech from especially Amber Heard's statements in court. And this is being done especially by younger people, by the huge Gen Z audience on TikTok. So maybe we could start there. What's been your read about what's been distinctive about that aspect of the mediatization of the case?
I'm 35 years old. I am not a TikTok user, so it's a little harder for me to speak about that specifically. I do think that people who are horrified by this and horrified by the misogynist tinge of some of the giddy social media behavior, I think they have a point. I think that there is certainly an intense amount of vitriol pointed toward this woman. As I said, something's got to be going on with the social media algorithms. the way that, they are just pushing. I mean, you can scroll, at least on Twitter, you can scroll down and, see Johnny Depp, Amber Heard coverage on a pretty constant basis, whether or not you're even looking for it. I mean, I can't think of any other story in recent memory that's been, thrust in front of eyeballs as aggressively as this one, across platforms, Facebook to Instagram as well. Certainly TikTok. I mean, I think that people are treating this like a topical media spectacle because it is. I mean, it's the most watched thing. It's, this massive news story. That probably speaks to certain pathologies of our culture, just as anything does, but it's not too hard to understand why people are glued to this. I mean, it's, extremely famous people airing out the dirtiest possible laundry in front of a massive audience. And one of them is lying about some of the most serious things imaginable. I mean, I think they're all lying at times, but one is, almost certainly lying more often about very serious things. And there's a lot of drama there.
So I have a very sort of general question. Like, how does this fit into the vibe shift that we've been talking about in the media? Like, I think that there is something going on, and I think Zoomers are like more representative of this, because they're like, when you were younger, you were like sort of more, your finger was more on the pulse. Like you were talking to your friends, and I actually don't know how it works in the post-COVID world. I can't imagine what hanging out is now, but are we seeing sort of a vibe shift in how people approach these sort of like MeToo type stories, where people are being more, I think that Joe Biden might have been the sort of like leading edge of this trend, where we're like, okay, there was like credible, stories about Joe Biden, but like, he's our guy, the other guy's worse.
And also him going to his inauguration with all the trappings of a kind of woke PMC millennial language. Maybe that was sort of a kind of jumping of the shark of that kind of idiom. I mean, I was just wondering if like this case has been really forced on us to try to create a sort of men versus women like content creation culture war, but actually what's been created is more of a generational culture war between woke pro-Me Too millennials and the Zoomers coming up below them, who are kind of looking for their own language. I don't know.
I mean, I think there's probably something to a lot of those theses. As far as I can tell, there's definitely a strong right-wing contingent that's definitely glommed onto this case. Like within a couple minutes, a few like ultra right-wing accounts tweeted out pictures of Johnny Depp like cheering. I think some production still from some of his movies, things like that. So, obviously making it very clear that they're on his side. I mean, so what I wrote about was trying to resist the idea that this does reflect, or that it necessarily should reflect, any political narrative. And where I came at that was that, as far as I can tell, the broader left media space, and I think to some extent academia, are very ardently on Heard's side. Have argued that she is an imperfect victim, but is clearly telling the truth. And if believe women means anything, it means supporting someone who is getting just dragged through the gauntlet by her clearly abusive ex, who is, putting her through this horrific spectacle, dragging her through a defamation case. Obviously, abusers do use the court system a lot. And I think the problem with that narrative is that this is not a case that fits that fact pattern very well. I mean, I think that I fundamentally don't understand how anyone could look at all the facts of this case honestly and not come to the conclusion that she's lying and she's not credible, and he sucks in a lot of ways. I'm not trying to, make a hard case for Johnny Depp. I'm not, there have been hashtag justice for Johnny Depp posts all over the place. And I think people who want to turn this into a righteous fight of their own, because I do think that a lot of the people who, are commenting about this from the perspective that I just spoke to from Amber Heard's side are coming from a righteous place, and, are making these arguments that they can be passionate about for political reasons. And the one I'm making is not one that I'm passionate about. This is an asshole movie star whose ex, I do think, lied about him, and I think that the evidence makes that pretty plain. That doesn't mean that he was perfect. That means that I think he did, behave pretty reprehensibly in a lot of cases. But I do think that it seems clear that she made up key defamatory details that are exactly what she was invoking with the op-ed. And whether or not it rises to the definition of technical defamation, or if you want to talk about the wisdom of, using the court system in that way, or the precedent that it set, blah, 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 all of those things. I'm like agnostic about these things. I'm not saying that it should have happened, but if he is right, I mean, if she did make all of this up and, tarnish his, like, I understand why one would use defamation law in this way if she did in fact give him, a hat, something to hang his hat on in terms of launching a suit. So yeah, I just don't think that this is a case to try to turn into a referendum about politics, because it's not a case that fits a political narrative that I or anyone else really wants to forward. I think that this is an unusual, terrible situation.
Can I ask you a question? And this is kind of like a little bit technical, a little bit outside of the bounds of what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. This op-ed, it was allegedly or like proven to be drafted by ACLU staff. Mm-hmm. Now I've worked at a think tank. I've written pieces for other people, or like, different organizations, politicians, things like that. And this was quite common. Like, so people, if you want to understand how that works, it's quite common that somebody will just slap this on your desk. You're like, donor wants this. Can you do this? You're like, absolutely. I'll write Hillary Clinton's marijuana policy, for example.
Yeah. So I'm
not saying that's a truth. I did write that, but
just for listeners, this is the American Civil Liberties Union, to whom Heard was a donor, although they later complained that she didn't see through all the donations after the op-ed had come out. They co-wrote the op-ed that she's now being sued for. I think that's a very interesting dimension.
A lot of people are very shocked by this, but I mean, I could see how if it fit. I'm shocked in a way that it doesn't fit into their sort of mission statement, but I'm not shocked that they did something for a donor. What was interesting is that there's an Elon Musk connection, and I don't know if you could address this, but there are some people saying that that donation was covered by Elon Musk, our civil liberties giant or whatever. Mm-hmm. I found that angle quite interesting. I mean, just this trial has everything.
Yeah. So basically, the donations came up. So her divorce from Johnny Depp and the settlement, she got, I believe, $7 million in like forgiveness of joint debts. So like he took on, mortgages from their joint property or whatever. And she got $7 million in cash, I believe. And, people who were skeptical of her story then were basically saying that, she had done this for money. We're saying that she is a gold digger. And she, very pointedly rejected that and said, no, I'm not even keeping this money. I want nothing. I donated it half to the ACLU and half to the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. She swore to that under oath in the UK. And, a lot of her defenders have said like, well, she pledged, she shouldn't have said donated, but this is how donations work. And I think to some extent that is true. But I think it's also very clear that when you see how she was using these statements in context, and when you see how the judge in the UK, took this statement and put it in context as far as his understanding of the case, it really was meant to mislead people into thinking that there couldn't possibly be a financial motive here. So she did begin to, I think she paid the first $250,000. And then right after her divorce, I think overlapping, but who cares? She started dating Elon Musk at some point in 2016, and he, a financial entity associated with him donated the next, I want to say 500,000 or 800,000, something in that ballpark, and basically donated it in her name against the total. And then about 14 months after the original divorce settlement, she was sued for the first, yes, I think it was about 14 months later, she was sued for the op-ed after the final payment came in, and then eventually stopped making those payments to the ACLU or to the Children's Hospital.
See, all of this is happening in a realm that is so far above the lives of ordinary people, and so whatever the kind of dynamics of domestic violence in it are so different to the dynamics of domestic violence as most people, particularly women, experience it, that I think you're absolutely dead right that this kind of extrapolation of a politics from these highly complex and highly idiosyncratic romantic relationships is actually impossible. In some ways, that is actually a critique of MeToo itself, which effectively did precisely that. But I mean, this ACLU thing I think is fascinating and really kind of points to like the material basis of MeToo, or the institutional basis of MeToo in some ways. I mean, the fact that the ACLU have so royally fucked this up as to get her done for defamation, you'd think that these people would have some lawyers to look over the thing and stop precisely this case happening. But another kind of institutional thing about Me Too that I saw being observed this week was actually the way that the magazines, the online magazines, the online ecosystem that you would expect to be taking up Amber Heard's side in this against the evil, nihilistic Zoomer TikTokers and outright people taking Johnny Depp's side, Salon, Jezebel, The Cut, Teen Vogue, all of them peaked around 2018, peaked during Me Too, and have been on a real downward trajectory since, according to the statistics I saw. So it's kind of interesting to see that, like, trying to do a Me Too battle for the soul of feminism in 2022, like, is dealing with totally different terrain to how they were trying to deal with that when all this started in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the decline of digital media has a lot of variables associated with it. I don't necessarily think it's, because of Me Too that digital media has ceased to be profitable, or has like run out of whatever venture capital that it was burning off and never was just not profitable enough given the growth projection that they were trying to sell shares on, or whatever the issue is. I mean, my critique of the Me Too movement, and I think that it did introduce a lot of important cultural change. I think that some of the conversations that it invoked were very important. I think ultimately it was too focused on, ultra competitive professional fields and too focused on individual catharsis, when it should have been about building worker power. I think that, however many years after Me Too, I think, that the death of Me Too isn't people not believing Amber Heard with her myriad problems with her narrative. It's the fact that, you know, working class people aren't better able to contest sexual harassment in most cases than they were before. They don't have, you know, stronger unions. They don't have, you know, better labor protections. You know, in some cases, I don't want to make a complete blanket statement, but, you know, that to me is the tragedy of Me Too, that this wasn't framed as more of a labor issue for people.
Actresses rather than chambermaids.
I saw Tarana Burke speak was 2 years ago, and that was exactly what she said. You know, she said, this is often about, you know, and I had a lunch with Kimberly Crenshaw about same time around 2 years ago, and they both said this is about girls working at Burger King, like more so than it is about movie stars or, you know, Harvey Weinstein or whatever. There's like real material interest in people who are like, you know, the subaltern, you know, really suffering, and we're not seeing that played out or change.
Well, if you want to deep dive further on the deep state connections to Me Too, go back to our episode of about a year ago with Tara Reid. You're listening to The Popular Show, or some of you are watching it even. We're delighted to be joined by Natalie Shure. I'm going to break in and say that if you're enjoying the show, if you like the guests we get, the conversations we have, then we'd love it if you would help us sustain the project over at patreon.com/The Popular Pod, where you're going to get the full version of this conversation and many more. Or if you just want to drop us a donation, you can do that at PayPal. And we also have the Buy Us a Coffee app as well. We're going to carry on talking with Natalie. Some of the other great work you've been doing at the New Republic this year has been on Havana Syndrome. I wondered if we could get into this. But by the end of this conversation, this episode, the Patreon episode, all of these threads in your work will have come together as one coherent item. But people are going to have to wait to see what the punchline is as far as that's concerned. But tell us about Havana Syndrome, because actually this is exactly the sort of thing that slips out of the news agenda, and then you're reminded of it and think, did that actually happen? What was Havana Syndrome?
Yeah, so Havana Syndrome started in 2016, the very end of 2016, basically right after Trump's election, which obviously not a lot of people saw coming, and threatened to completely throw off course all of the scene staging that had been happening in Cuba. Obama, you know, reopened diplomatic relations in 2015. Many more diplomats and spies under diplomatic cover ended up being transferred to Cuba, building new professional and personal relationships, bringing their kids to go to school over there, the whole shebang. And then Trump gets elected, and obviously had a very different orientation toward Cuba and détente, and people's lives are thrown into disarray. I think on a personal level, we can understand just how stressful that would be. You know, whatever you think about people in foreign service or CIA, you know, on a personal level, like, yeah, they moved their kids, they moved their families, they had been there for a year in some cases, blah, blah. So very, very stressful, uncertain, confusing time. In this context, a couple people at a time started to experience really bizarre symptoms, stationed in and around Havana. You know, they'd hear a strange sound and get headaches, bad fatigue, dizziness, nausea in some cases, and you know, couldn't figure out what it was. The fact that it was associated for many people with the same piercing noise before the onset of symptoms got the government very nervous that this could be, the first theory was a sonic weapon. being used against a lot of the original so-called victims were, under diplomatic cover in the CIA. So they thought that they were being targeted specifically. Very early on, when you actually go and reconstruct what happened, very early on, the State Department and CIA basically sits its people down and says, listen, we think that there might be mysterious attacks on you and your family. If you start feeling things like headache, nausea, vertigo, it could be, you could be being attacked with a weapon that we're not fully aware of. Just give us a heads up if you feel any of those symptoms.
So they were warning that the Cubans had a sound weapon that
was the original hypothesis.
That would give you chronic illness and anxiety.
Anxiety wasn't part of the discussion at that point. That would induce symptoms, that are largely associated with chronic malaise, chronic anxiety, chronic depression, stress, etc.
Which is otherwise called being a State Department official. I mean, so
being a human being.
I'm gonna go off a bit in my DC capacity. People who work at the State Department are some of the most selfless people alive. They do a lot of good work. Mm-hmm. In my experience, are also the most neurotic people I've ever met in my life, which is, and I mean that in the nicest way possible, like some of the kindest, like they're fastidious. The State Department process to get hired is extremely hard. There's a number of tests that are you have to be extremely fastidious just to pass those tests. There's a number of protocols you have to learn to be in the State Department and be successful. It's the last bastion of actual old world comedy that we have in the United States. We don't have that here, in that way. I find in my experience dealing with those people that is often aligned with other things that make them very good at that make their lives less desirable. And when I heard about this, I said, oh, these people are just having anxiety. And that was my first reaction, just because I knew that these people were having background anxiety anyway. And then when Trump came in, Trump got rid of the bookshelves in the State Department, all these different things. They felt under attack already. Is that possible that there was an environmental reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of set it up with the job stress to suggest that I think that the stage was certainly set for a mass sociogenic illness. A very pressure cooker situation where people are in a somewhat insular community. They hear about really terrible and frightening things happening to their neighbors. Later on, it was discovered that the high-pitched screeching sound that people described and that other people recognized, and I think, heard in some cases, and then developed symptoms as well, that was a species of cricket that a lot of them had outside of their windows that, if you listen to the sound recordings, was particularly loud when the mating call bounces off walls and stuff, has an echo. So the original theory was that this was a sonic weapon because of the association with the screech and the similarity of the symptoms and what appears to me in hindsight to be an utter lack of familiarity with, symptoms of malaise and functional symptoms. And as you said, symptoms of anxiety and depression. These can be very debilitating things. They're fairly common. And so then Havana Syndrome starts spreading around the world. There were cases in China, and then they trickle outward. There are cases in Russia. There are a few cases in the United States.
All experienced by US diplomats, State Department people, CIA people.
Primarily, yes. I think some congressional staff who work on foreign issues, but people who are part of the national security blob or blob adjacent, NatSec people is definitely, like the NatSec universe is definitely what is experiencing this. And it's taken incredibly seriously. Obviously by the people experiencing it who, I think it's one thing to hear about this publicly, but then you have a very credible friend and you don't think that they're crazy and they have this experience and you take it seriously. And I think that, the way that it played out and, the credulate, like this did become a very serious issue within the government. I think at first the Trump government was kind of, dismissing it and used it as a pretext to shut down or scale back their Cuban operations as they'd already planned to. But then they kind of tried to shut it down. And I think that sort of galvanized some of the hashtag resistant types who in the government who, thought this looked like a cover up. And so then when Biden became president, there was sort of this reaction of, now that the good guys are in charge, we're really going to get to the bottom of Havana Syndrome. And they put together all these task forces and cases just grew and grew and grew and grew. And it was never anything but mass sociogenic illness.
So I'll give you an example of just the type of stuff that was going on at this time when it transitioned from Obama to Trump. I was working with a trade mission sort of like PR firm at the time. And this is when I was working with Michael Brooks at the time. And I was doing this during the daytime. And we were going to throw an electronica concert at the opening of like sort of Cuba-US relationships. And like, we're like doing all this sort of stuff. And then Trump came in and it just shut all of a sudden. That's what I started to hear about Havana Syndrome and sort of these other things, is when sort of like relations sort of shut down and like things were changing, and it seemed to be related more to tension that people were having around this changing relationship than it had to do with like actual physicality.
So spooks got Trump derangement syndrome too, basically.
Well, I think that was especially true after it started to become associated with Russia. So, only in the very early days did people think, oh, maybe the Cubans are behind this. And I think that the, Republicans, like I said, I think that they kind of trumped that up in order to have a justifiable pretext to do what they already wanted to do, which was scale back diplomatic relations again, the way that they had been. But then there were some. So another way that I think people have gotten Havana Syndrome wrong is a lot of people have said things like, oh, well, you just believe everything the CIA says. And this was not something that the government was necessarily peddling. I think that, overall, the agencies were, in an official capacity, pretty hesitant about this, I think, until somewhat recently when Biden really started to push it as an issue. But for the first several years, I think the agencies themselves were very doubtful, but then you had these, whistleblowers, basically people who saw themselves as whistleblowers who were, they thought they were doing this righteous crusade on behalf of the victims of Havana Syndrome. And so when it sort of became associated with Russia, that people started saying, the Soviet Union did have a history of researching. They decided that the sonic weapons no longer made sense. If you had a sonic weapon, it would make such a loud noise, so it wouldn't be just like a weird beep. So they came up with this alternate theory that it was a microwave weapon and that the sound was not an actual sound, that it was basically this phenomenon called the Fry effect, which I don't remember the actual mechanisms, but if you are exposed to microwaves at a high enough level, then you might hear noises that aren't there. That was, a ridiculous theory because, we already knew that the sound was crickets at this point. So, you didn't have to keep, accommodating the existence of the sound in your theory to encapsulate this, but it still stuck around. And, microwaves, like I said, had been studied by the Soviet Union, and people kind of posited, okay, this is something that, you know, could be invisible and could hypothetically cause damage somewhat akin to what seems to be causing this. But it was all very grasping at straws. But I think people were, you know, especially like, you know, this group of foreign policy NatSecchi Democrats, you know, Adam Schiff, Mark Warner, Gene Sheehan, those types, the very like hawkish moderates, they really loved this. They really banged the drums on Havana Syndrome very hard because it allowed them to be like, you know, anti-Russia and tough and that sort of thing. And it just went on for years and years and years. And I just got so into this because I'm very interested in sociogenic illness and you know, mind body issues and health, and this I thought was a very classic sociogenic illness. And you know, sociogenic, what I think of is that you know, I've always emphasized, I think that the people who claim to be suffering from Havana syndrome, many of whom, you know, stayed sick for a long time, I think that they were being utterly sincere, and I think that they were quite debilitated. I think that we all know people in our lives who have been, you know, seriously debilitated by symptoms like these. And you know, mental health can drive very, very powerful suffering. You know, there are all sorts of symptoms that just don't that harm us, that aren't, you know, organic disease as we would think of it. But the diagnosis itself and the sociological understanding of the illness, I think, does have like a social contagion factor, and that was certainly happening here. So I think in the early days when it was still in Cuba, I think that it was a very classic sociogenic illness, the sort of thing where, you know, if you're in a room and all of a sudden you hear that there's poisonous gas in the room, a lot of people will start like choking and writhing and that sort of thing because they are, you know, induced with terror and belief, blah, blah. I think that some cases were probably close to that. But a lot of them are just, you know, like misascribing symptoms to something that didn't actually cause them. So we do know that things like, you know, headaches, chronic fatigue, dizziness, etc., all of the symptoms that these people are experiencing are incredibly common and experienced by, you know, a certain number of people each year. And then I think that they just kind of started getting matched to this diagnosis. You know, and it went on for a very long time. And, you know, the more that media peddles these things, then like the sociogenesis continues. And only when people kind of back away from it, as I've had a news alert for this for years. It's finally dying down, and you know, I think that it's a pretty discredited idea at this point. And you know, sure enough, we're not seeing cases anymore.
Yeah, well, we want to connect this to the question of long COVID in a bit in the patrons episode. So if you want to hear us talking about that, you're going to have to get over to patreon.com/the popular pod. But I mean, I've got a couple of sort of takes on Havana syndrome to chuck at you and see what you think. So on the one hand, I mean, for all David speaking of the good work of his friends in the State Department, here's the vulgar anti-imperialist reading of the situation, that this is the weight and trauma of overseeing a crumbling empire finally kind of getting under people's skin, Trump being the last straw. I suppose, you know, David, if you're saying that this is kind of the last corner of American governance that still has those kind of old standards of the sort of previous American ruling class, I guess the difference is that they don't drink enough to keep all of those kind of traumatic actions at bay anymore. So, I mean, there's the kind
that's
of
generational.
Apologizing.
I think that's generational. I think the younger employees are probably more likely to experience. This is non-scientific, but I'm going to say that I would say 45 and under probably more likely to experience this.
Yeah,
because the guys 45 and older are all drinking.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the most prominent Havana Syndrome patients were definitely in their 50s.
Okay.
Lenzai and Mark Palomaropoulos, off the top of my head, were two of the biggest ones to go public. Overall, I don't know the numbers because only a certain fraction of them came forward publicly. But I don't necessarily think it skewed one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, I do just find it funny.
I actually like to hear that.
Yeah, I do just find it funny that they couldn't be more like worldly wise about the arrival of Trump, and that they effectively acted like the craziest basic lib on Twitter with this. The other thing I was thinking was how much this reminds me of the kind of projection that goes on in the American security services, where historically whatever they say the other countries are doing is what they're doing at the time. I'm thinking of the way that in the 50s the CIA put out all this stuff about Chinese brainwashing, and all that goes into the Manchurian Candidate story at precisely the time that the MK Ultra experiments in exposing civilian populations to LSD, to experiment on whether people's brains could be controlled, and all the gory, appalling details in David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard, about these allegations of individual murders and so on carried out by people who were known to the security services, shall we say. I just think that kind of pattern of projection is very interesting to find this stuff being leaked or whistle-blown by people in these organizations that initially the claim is Cuba. Oh no, Russia has invented, and it bears repeating, a sound weapon that gives you anxiety. That claim is going on at just the time that we're getting drip-fed this stuff about, maybe there was a lab leak in Wuhan. Maybe, actually, Fauci's trust was investing money in the research that's going on here. We don't have a biological weapons facility in Ukraine. We have a biological center. This kind of without kind of exaggerating what the kind of facts of those matters are. It's very interesting to find simultaneously kind of claims of disease being used as a weapon of war by America's rivals at precisely the time when they're being they're having exactly those accusations directed at them, fairly or unfairly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that the reason I went so hard at Havana Syndrome, besides it just becoming obsessed with it and like wanting to debunk it and just feeling completely exasperated by anyone's credulousness about what was going on here, I think that it's very straightforwardly bad to have this unchecked narrative that a foreign power is attacking Americans everywhere in the world, chasing them down with ray guns. I mean, that's eventually that does beg a response. And so, I think that there was at one point a very real concern that, if this became like a salient enough issue that, it drummed up support with public. I mean, certainly like self-identified Havana Syndrome victims were starting to organize and lobby and become this force who was really they were really pushing for some sort of response. Some people in the Senate were starting to chat about that. So I think that those things were very dangerous because we are an aggressive imperial nation by many accounts, as you mentioned. As for the moral injury thesis, that's been something that people have brought up, and I think that does make a certain amount of sense. But kind of like what David was saying, a lot of the people who started identifying as Havana Syndrome sufferers were low-level consular officers and stuff within the State Department. It certainly wasn't only people who had done terrible shit. And I think a lot of the people who got this and had done terrible shit were like very proud of the things that they did. The most prominent Havana Syndrome patient who like became the chief whistleblower was this guy named Mark Polymeropoulos, who was a pretty high up guy in the CIA. And basically my, psychological read on him is that he, very high up in the CIA, very much associated his own identity with the CIA, thought very highly of himself as a tough guy, et cetera. And then, develops this illness that makes him have to retire early. And like, that's hard. That happens to some people. And I think that people go through various forms of grief over it. I'm not, I think that the guy sucks for many reasons, but I'm not going to like mock him for that. That's really hard. And I think that, for him, he didn't want to see himself as someone who was felled by like, who couldn't hack it, who got depressed and couldn't handle a few headaches and blah, blah, blah. So instead, he was a hero who was felled by an act of war, by a hostile power. And then he rises to the occasion to become, this hero, this crusader, fighting for others, fighting to, expose the way that heroes have been ignored and sidelined by the government. Like who wouldn't want to see themselves that way? So I think that's where he's coming from. But, I think he's very fucking pleased with himself about what he did professionally, unfortunately.
This is The Popular Show with me, James A. Smith, and David Slavic, and our wonderful guest, Natalie Shure. If you want to hear the rest of this conversation, you're going to need to get over to patreon.com/thepopularpod and join our little podcast community. We'd love to have you over there helping us grow the project. We're going to talk about long COVID now. If you want to join us on the podcast, we'd love you to be listening. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.